This is arguably the most challenging time of year to be out fly fishing. Runoff is in full force, the rivers are high, they're muddy, and to the untrained eye, they look like they're just about impossible to fish. A ton of anglers will actually just pack it up and head for lakes or ponds this time of year, and I know some folks who just don't fish during runoff. They just sit there and wait for the rivers to come back into shape. Well, you don't need to do that because it is entirely possible to catch fish during runoff. In fact, I reckon that if you can catch fish during runoff, you can catch fish just about anywhere.
This is Untangled, Fly Fishing for Everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant, excited to be behind the microphone for yet another week of hopefully excellence in podcasting. I know I enjoy the heck out of myself when I get to sit here every week, and I hope that y'all are finding it informative and entertaining. And I mean, seriously, who doesn't want to come and listen to me talk about wings and Diet Coke every week with a little bit of fly fishing sprinkled into it? I mean, come on. Where else are you going to get this level of insight and hilarity? I mean, nowhere. Let's be honest. I am really stoked that y'all chose to be here, chose to spend some time with me this week. I do appreciate it. This is a lot of fun, and I really enjoy the time we get to sit and chat all about fly fishing every week. And we're going to talk about a topic this week that I don't know that it gets the attention it deserves, especially for beginners, because we've got the sunlight out now, the weather's great, and we get really eager to get out of the water this time of year, but the rivers are high and muddy. I don't know about everybody, but for me right now, my rivers are straight chocolate milk, and this used to be really a really frustrating, really disheartening time of year for me because I'm not the greatest stillwater angler in the world. I'll admit that. And I don't like fishing lakes and ponds all that much. I enjoy the high mountain stuff, the smaller stuff, but the big reservoirs and stuff, I've never really fallen in love with that. I got fishing buddies who love it. It's just never been quite my cup of tea. Well, this time of year when runoff hits, you can go fish those. You can go fish your still water, or you can head to a tailwater. And tailwaters tend to be really crowded this time of year because they're generally the only thing that's flowing at a rate where you can actually get into it and fish it. And we actually had a podcast listener, Brian from Wyoming. He encapsulated all of this in a great question he sent in recently. He said, "Hello, Spencer, fellow Wyoming transplant here, though I come from the Rocky Mountain Cup rival state of Colorado." I'll try and forgive you for that, Brian. I've got a question related to the current fishing season with the variable river conditions we experience in the Rockies. Spring runoff has turned many creeks and rivers very brown after a warm stretch of weather on some days from the accelerated snowmelt. What is your approach when you pull up to a creek that is normally clear, but because of the runoff, the water is as dark and murky as a flat and warm Diet Coke? I like that, Brian. Thank you. Do you change locations or change up your strategy on that water? Do you go out of your way in your research before heading out to determine the runoff conditions and avoid the murky waters entirely? I appreciate your instruction and look forward to using all of your advice on my next adventure. Thank you for making the fly fishing community a better place. Brian, thank you for that. I really do appreciate everything you had to say there. And I wanted to read your question entirely because I wanted you to know that you're not alone, and I wanted everybody else to hear from another beginner angler that you're not alone in being discouraged and thinking that, okay, well, what do I do? And do I need to do more research before I head out to the water? I mean, I generally don't do a whole ton of research before I head out to the water to the rate that I used to because I've been doing this. I've been doing this long enough that you get a real feel for when things should and shouldn't be fishing. Now, that being said, I do check flows, especially this time of year, to see if something is, excuse me, to see if something is too high to fish. I will check that stuff. I don't do a whole ton of research though. I like to just kind of wing it and hope for the best sometimes. But Brian, like I said, I wanted to read your question. so that everybody can hopefully relate. Those of us who want to fish this time of year, but we can't. I really tried to start thinking more critically about fishing during runoff a few years ago because I remember talking to some buddies of mine who talked about fly fishing during runoff and catching some really nice fish when they were doing it. And I was really jealous because, like, well, I want to do that. And it feels like every time I've gone out to try and fish runoff myself, it's just been a complete and total disaster. But when you think about it critically, trout still have to eat, right? Even if the water's high and muddy, they're not going to quit eating, especially when we have the bigger bugs finally starting to move around. Runoff really hits when the stoneflies start coming out. A lot of mayflies are out this time of year. I've seen some caddis buzzing around already. So we know that the bugs are active, and we know that when bugs are active, the trout are going to be active too. So it stands to reason that even if a river's high and muddy, the trout are going to eat, right? Well, I thought that through and I had that thought process and I started doing some research, started talking to some folks, and it turns out that when I did that critical thinking about runoff a while ago, that was one of the few times in my life that I was right about an assumption. It does not happen to me very often, but it did this time. And after I realized that, hey, trout still got to eat. They're still going to eat. We got to go out and try. I made a concerted effort to spend more time out on the water during runoff, and it's starting to pay dividends for me. I'll give you an example. A few weeks ago, we've had kind of an up and down spring here in Wyoming. It's been really warm, and then it'll be really cold again. So runoffs like started and it stopped 4 or 5 times, but I think it's finally going in full force right now. And a few weeks ago, it was during one of those warmer spells, and I went to my local creek because I was going stir crazy. I needed to fish. And I get to the water, and sure enough, it is chocolate milk. It is maybe 3 inches of visibility in the water, if that. But it's not running super high. It was just really off color. It was about a foot, maybe foot and a half higher than it was a couple of days before when it was still running clear the last time I'd fished it. But I pull up and I realize that, okay, well, it's really muddy. What am I going to do? How am I going to approach this? Well, because I've been working on improving my skills during runoff and improving my ability to catch fish during runoff, I knew that I needed to opt for some heavy flies that are going to get down because when the river comes up, when the water comes up, the current speed increases. So you do need to make sure you're fishing a little bit heavier nymphs. And you really do focus on nymphing or streamers this time of year because the fish really probably aren't going to be coming up for dries. So I put on really big Pat's rubber leg stonefly, and then I had I honestly don't remember what else I had on there. Probably another stonefly pattern. I think I had 2 stonefly nymphs on, and throw it out there. I mend it, and I get those flies drifting just in the slow water on the slack side of the foam line. So I've got the fast side, and then the foam line, and then the slack side. So I've got them in the calmest water. They're down. I can feel them ticking the bottom, and I fished probably 15 minutes and finally got a bite, set the hook, and I caught one of the nicest rainbows I've caught out of my local creek. It was it was like, I think it was almost a 16-inch rainbow. The browns in there tend to get a lot bigger. So when you get into a nice sized rainbow, it's a pleasant surprise. And it fought hard. It jumped. It was beautiful. I brought it in and let it go. And I was really stoked about that because it felt like that was almost the culmination of all my efforts to fish during a runoff lately because it all paid off. I went there, even though it was muddy and high. I threw my flies out there, and what do you know? It worked out the way it should. And it just feels so satisfying when everything comes together like that in a fly fishing plan. So from that story, though, we do learn a couple of things. We learn a few things about runoff. Uh, we learn that trout have a much better eyesight than we give them credit for. Unless the river is like more mud than actual water, the fish can see pretty well, and they're going to eat when they see a bug come by them. And then even when the water gets muddy, trout still got to eat. They'll eat when the bugs are active, and the bugs are active during runoff, so that means the fishing can be good, right? So if we agree that trout will eat during high, muddy water, and as long as the river isn't more mud than water, it's probably a lot more fishable than you originally thought when you pulled up to it. But where exactly should you focus on fishing, right? You pull up, you're like, okay, well, the fish still got to eat, but where do I fish at this point? Because when the river comes up during runoff, it can change the way the river looks, right? You've got riffles in places you didn't. The holding water is dramatically decreased. The pockets kind of disappear because the water's flowing over it instead of through it. It changes the entire dynamic of the fishery. So, how do you handle that? Well, I'll give you another story here to try and illustrate that. Last year, back on the local creek, it was June, and last year was our crazy winter that we had in Wyoming. Um, it snowed a whole bunch. It was super super cold, and runoff started really late, and it lasted forever. So I got up on the local creek. I went up as high as I could, thinking, "Oh, I'll get away from the worst of the runoff." Because usually, the higher you go, the least or the less the runoff is. And there were salmon flies hatching up high. So I was really excited, but the water was still way too high and it was moving way too quick for those trout to even think about coming up to eat the salmon fly, dry flies. So what I did is I got some salmon fly nymphs and I got down really deep. So I put like, it was almost 9 foot of tippet, I think, between the indicator and the first fly. And I went and I found the only pockets of soft water. There's a stretch where the river bends, and on the bend there was a big rock that even in runoff wasn't covered, and there was a pocket right behind the rock where the water kind of slowed down. And I threw my stonefly nymphs in there, got them down really deep, and I started catching fish. It was awesome. What was really interesting though is because the water was so high and moving so fast, I almost didn't even get in the water at all. So I did a lot of this fishing from the bank, and you'll find that's pretty common when you get into the uh, when you get into fishing runoff like that. It's pretty common to not get in the water too much because A, it's kind of dangerous, and B, I mean, a lot of the good waters can be closer to the bank where there's a lot more friction from the bank and then any other structure to create that softer water. But that story teaches us the value of focusing on the slower water, getting down deep, and waiting safely. Those are three keys that I really can't iterate enough, right? We need to make sure that you focus on that slower water. You focus on the water where the fish are likely to hold. Because I found that rock, I put the nymphs right behind it where there was a nice pocket, and it was slow enough, and I got them down to the bottom effectively enough that the fishes came up and they ate those bugs. It was wonderful, right? But I focused on that slow water. I got them deep, and then I made sure that I was staying safe while I'm waiting. Um, Again, I can't reiterate those points enough because at the end of the day, when I tell you, when we describe how to read water and how to find fish in a river, like we've been doing in the beginner masterclass lately, uh, what we're teaching you is look for the places where there's transitions in water speeds, where there's seams, right? Where there's fast and slow water, where they meet. Trout love seams. They're going to hang out on them. We know this. So even when the water's high, even when it's muddy, if you can find a seam, if you can find a pocket, if you can find any kind of slow water, that's where you want to focus. Throw your nymphs in that stuff, and you're going to be in business, right? And this even plays out on tailwaters or freestones or even spring creeks that might get high. They might not get muddy, but they might get a ton of extra water this time of year. I know the Green River in Utah is a great example of this, right? There's usually I think it's a 7 to 10 day window where they bump the flows up really high and they push a bunch of water downstream to simulate a runoff event. And when that happens, the river rises 3 or 4 feet, and all the guides tie on nymph rigs, and they all focus on that soft, deep water. It's that same concept where we're looking for the good holding water. It just changes the nature a little bit when the water gets up this high. And obviously, when it gets muddy, you might have to be a little bit more persistent in your drifts. That's one thing that I kind of glossed over in both of those stories, but I fished hard for the fish that I caught. It wasn't just a get up, catch the fish, or throw the flies in and catch the fish. It wasn't that simple. I fished hard. That first one, the nice rainbow I told you all about, I think I might have said I was there for 15 minutes. It was probably longer than that. I was there for a while, and that was the only fish I caught, too. I know I fished a couple hours that day, and I caught one, right? So it might not always be this wonderful, super amazing experience like you think it should be, but you can still get into some good fish, which I was able to experience. Now, I want to tie all of this back to the original premise of the show, something that I talked about in the hook to the show, which is if you can learn to recognize the water where fish are going to hold, even when the water's up high during runoff, I think you can catch fish anywhere because that means you have the skills to recognize and read water. And that's the number one skill, I think, beyond anything else that you need to be a successful fly angler. Fishing during runoff and being effective while you do it is mostly about recognizing water where trout are going to hold, slow, deep pockets, and then getting your flies in front of those fish. Heavy flies are a must this time of year. I use tons of Pat's rubber legs. Split shot, you're going to need all of those. Flashy junk flies, we might refer to stuff like a squirmy wormy, anything with really bright colors that the fish might be able to see better, right? Those bright colors create a lot of contrast, so the fish will key in on them. Anything that we might call a junk fly is a great fly to use this time of year because it stands out, it catches the fish's attention, and they'll likely move on it, right? Now, I do want to remind you guys, this is going to be some of the toughest fishing I think you'll do. And it's entirely possible you get skunked. I got skunked a ton when I made a concerted effort to fish during runoff more often. But if you start to figure it out, you are going to be surprised at the sort of fish that you can run into. All right. Now, with all that said, I got to add one final caveat that just about every river and creek is going to reach a point during runoff where it really isn't possible to fish it. There's almost no calm water within casting distance. All that calm water is below the surface so deep that it's almost not feasible to really get into it. We know, and if you've watched our beginner fly fishing masterclass, you've seen this. I believe it was in the Currents and Seams video, but the water at the bottom of the river is moving slower than the water at the top, right? If you look at it, you do like a cross section of the river, the stuff flowing across the riverbed is moving a lot slower than any of the water up high. So when runoff happens, that's still true. So even if the top of the water doesn't look like there's any holding water, there still probably is down low. You just can't see it because the water is moving so fast. It's not creating that disturbance on the surface that we're used to seeing that tells us, hey, here's the holding water. So every river is going to get to that point where it just is not feasible to fish. Every river is going to have that. All right. At that point, like I said, I believe that trout just hunker down at the bottom. They hide behind the obstacles that we can't see beneath all that rushing water, and then they just get fat and happy. And we know they get fat and happy because high water knocks loose a bunch of food and fish can feed easily on it, but it's just not always fishable. So every river is going to get to a point like that. And if you are trying to fish when it's like that, you don't catch anything, don't feel discouraged, right? The tips that I went over today are more for here's how to fish runoff when it's high and muddy, not when it's like flood stage. Okay. And every river is going to hit maybe that flood stage just about every year. But if you can get out, like I said, if you can get out before that flood stage or right after it, you might just find out that you will catch some incredible fish. I'll give you guys one last story before we move on to the Q&A section of the show. A few years ago, I was fishing up high in the high country. The river was about 3 feet higher than normal and chocolate milk. Couldn't see into it, but there was this one really big pool where the water slowed down enough that there was some good holding water. And this was right when I was teaching myself how to Euro nymph. So I had a Euro rod, I had a 10-foot 3-weight, and then I had a big streamer on the bottom and then a worm. So I was dead drifting the streamer and the worm through this hole. And I sat there for, I don't know how long, making drift after drift after drift on this Euro rig. And nothing was happening. And I move up to the very top of this hole, and I was just about to call it a day, because I think I'd been there for 2-3 hours. I was just about to call it a day and hike back to the truck when my fly stopped. So I set the hook, and it just set into something solid. it felt like a log or a rock because I was like, oh, great. It's not moving. I can't get it. I'm sitting there yanking and yanking, trying to get the fly out. And then all of a sudden, the snag jumped. It was a huge cutthroat, jumps all the way out of the water, hits back in, goes into the main current, and rips upstream. And I'm just sitting there holding on. I have no idea how to react because I'm like, oh my goodness, that's the biggest fish I've ever seen. And I think at that point, that was the biggest fish I'd ever hooked on a fly rod. And this fish tears off upstream. And this stream, we're talking maybe 6-7 feet wide at its most. It is a small stream. It feeds into a lake where there's a lot of big fish and they run up into the stream to spawn. But this was well before the spawn. And I just thought I was going to hook into one of the resident fish that were in there. Well, that's not what happened because this fish, we went for a little rodeo. It goes all the way upstream and then it turns and I was trying to get it. I almost netted it. I about had it and then it escaped and it goes downstream and it took me all the way down into the lake. I ruined a pair of waders and no, not the way you're thinking. I slipped on rocks and tore them up as I went down because I followed this thing through the river. It got into the lake and it ran me to backing a couple of times in the lake. I finally caught it. It was a 26-inch cutthroat. Biggest cutthroat I'd ever caught on a fly rod until I finally caught something out of Pyramid Lake. And it was one of the most memorable fish, and I caught it in high, muddy, nasty water. So that is one of the reasons that it's worth getting out and trying this stuff because you never know what you're going to hook into. So hopefully y'all found that informative and helpful. And if you have any questions, any follow-ups about fly fishing during runoff, please do not hesitate to let me know and get in touch. And with that, folks, we are going to move on to the Q&A portion of this week's show. First question coming to us on the Q&A section this week is from Sam from New Jersey. Writes in and says, hey, it's Sam from New Jersey. Thanks again for answering my question about riffles and the masterclass video. I have been fishing a lot of dry flies, and throughout the day I run into fish denying my fly but rising to tiny flies. How do I see my fly when having to use a size 16 or 18? Also, it seems like lately my fly rod is so hard to take apart at the end of the day. I'm not pushing it together hard, but it takes a lot to get it apart. Any tips? Sam, thank you so much for the questions. I appreciate it. And I'm really stoked that you enjoyed the masterclass video about fishing and riffles. We had a ton of fun putting that thing together. Let me dive into your questions, all right? First off, if you are having trouble seeing your smaller dry flies, then what you can do is tie on a bigger dry fly ahead of them. I do this all the time, especially during mayfly hatches because you're fishing really just tiny bugs. I'll fish something like even a 14 or a 16 in front of it. Usually I'll tie on like a parachute Adams. That'll be my first fly. And then I put 18 to 24 inches of tippet, tie that off of the bend of the hook, and then I tie my smaller dry fly onto the end of that. You're able to follow the progress of your smaller fly by tracking the big one, and then that big one can even act like an indicator if your smaller fly sits really low in the surface film, since that bigger fly will move when fish take that smaller fly. That's really the best way that I've found to do it. I will say too, I don't know how much of a beginner you are. You didn't mention, but the more and more that you fish with small flies, the better you get at spotting them. It's definitely a learned skill, and I think the best tip for that, if you just fish with a single dry fly at the end of it and you don't want to tie two on, really just follow the end of your leader and then follow that up, and you should be able to pick your fly out at that point. Again, it's just a learned skill. It's something that the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. So it is one of those things that there's no silver bullet that makes it really easy and simple. It'd be real nice if there was, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with using that big dry fly as that indicator for your smaller dry fly. I do that all the time. It's a very effective way to help fish those small bugs. As for your fly rod question, rod sections certainly can get stuck together sometimes. I found that usually happens if you get some dirt or other junk in the female end of the ferrule. That's the joint where when you put your rods together, those are the ferrules, right, where they join together. And if you get too much junk in the female end of the ferrule, that can stop the rod sections from forming the right connection, and it'll trap air in the female ferrule. And that trapped air can sometimes cause the rod sections to stick together. And that's what's giving you grief when you're trying to pull it apart. If you're having a lot of issues, the methods that I've had work for me are I have a fishing buddy help pull the other section apart. That's usually the best bet. But if you're by yourself, then you can use the hands behind the knees trick. What you do is you put the fly rod behind your knees, you hold onto the rod with both hands, and then you use your knees to add some extra leverage as you push your knees out. So you put your hands on either side of your knees, you push out and try and pull the section that way. Use your knees to give you some extra leverage. I'll link a video. I found a video that demonstrates it. I'll put that in the podcast description so that you can see what it looks like. It's kind of hard for me to describe on video and audio here. But if that doesn't work, if for some reason you can't get it apart that way, I found a ton of folks on a whole bunch of fly fishing forums who swear by putting ice on the stuck ferrules. Literally just icing it, almost like you're bringing the inflammation down a little bit, and then you can pull them apart. So you can try all of those, and hopefully, if they really are stuck, you can use those to your advantage. Now, if you want to prevent this from happening in the first place, which is probably ideal, you can pick up some ferrule wax. A few different retailers sell ferrule wax. I've heard of that working. You just apply it every couple of times you go out fishing. I've personally never had an issue with my graphite fly rod ferrules sticking together, but waxing the ends of the ferrules of your graphite fly rod when you put it up at the end of the day of fishing is not a bad idea if you're having a lot of problems with it. So hopefully that helps, Sam, and thank you so much for sending that on in. Next question comes to us, Bev from Colorado. She writes in and says, I'm looking for an alternative to using my cell phone to take photos and videos on the river. I fish alone most of the time and find it challenging to use a phone while holding a fish and trying to release it quickly. It's only a matter of time before I drop it in the water. What do you use? I'm looking for something rugged, waterproof, and easy to handle with one hand or voice control. I'll mostly use it for pictures, so a zoom feature would be nice. But I also want the ability to take videos. I'd appreciate any recommendations. I've learned a lot from your podcast and really enjoy it. Keep up the great work. Bev, great question, and thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to put this question together. For me, I'm like the worst person to ask this question to, though. It's kind of funny. I've become comfortable enough with it that I use my phone to take pictures of fish when I'm by myself. I'm really not too worried about dropping my phone in the river. I reckon that if I do, it ain't really the end of the world. I would still have a flip phone if it was feasible for the line of work that I'm in, but it's not. So I have to be more connected than I'd like to be, but that is a completely other discussion that we could get into. It sounds like, though, your best bet here, what would really fit your needs would be an action camera of some kind, like a GoPro. We use GoPros here at VFC for filming a lot of fish releases. They work great. They're not the best for still photography. Pardon me for stumbling over my words there. The lens is so wide it has that fisheye effect, but they'll get the job done if you really want to do it. That's really probably your best bet for a rugged option that you can use with one hand. And there's a lot of different options for attaching a GoPro to yourself so that you don't drop it. Anything really much bigger than the GoPro is going to be kind of unwieldy to use on the water, in my opinion. Like, for example, when me and Alex are out filming, the guy running the camera is never fishing. It's just too much to handle. There's one guy on the camera, one guy fishing, and that's just how it's got to be, because you can either have the camera or you can fish, and we haven't worked out a way to do both very effectively without worrying about dropping a $3,000 or $4,000 camera right in the drink, and you do not want to have that happen. What I do to take pictures of trout, and not worry about the stress on the fish, and I can't stress enough the importance and value of having a net here, because I net the fish first. I get the fly out of its mouth, and then, of course, the entire time I've got the fish wet. It's in the water as much as possible. Then I'll reach in my waders, I'll grab my phone, open the camera, and since I'm right-handed, I do that all with my right hand. I grab the fish with my left hand and lift it up real quick, take a picture, and call it a day. I lift the fish gently, and if I take it out of the water completely, it's just for a few seconds. Snap the pick and let it swim away. That entire process, the fish is out of the water for maybe 5 to 8 seconds total, which is ideal. You don't want to do any more than that. That's going to put unnecessary stress on the fish. 5 to 8 seconds max, keeping it out of the water is ideal. Uh, I'm always handling that fish with wet hands as well. I wanted to make sure I made that point. Another thing I'll do is I almost always step out of the main current of the river, and I do all this near the bank. I don't try and do this in the middle of the river, maybe in the harder current or where it's deeper. I move. I've just found that's a lot easier, a lot simpler for me. I feel a lot more secure with my phone in my hands, and really, like I said, I'm just holding it with one hand. I'm doing that. Where I see a lot of folks struggle is trying to hold the fish in the other hand. They almost feel like they need two hands. Uh, I've found that no matter what I'm doing, if I'm taking a picture with my phone or if we're filming a release shot for VFC, the fish are a lot more cooperative for me when I don't squeeze them very hard. I just gently hold them, and they just seem to throw less of a fit when I do that. I don't know why. I just think that gentle touch. They love that gentle touch. It goes a long way. I'll also say that the more you try to take pictures of fish, the better you'll get at it. So you kind of run into a system that you like. But if you feel like picking up another camera, then certainly go for it. That's not a bad option to have either. That's my process. That's how I do it, and it works for me. But it does seem like a GoPro Bev would probably be your best option here. So thank you a bunch for sending that question in. Patrick from Colorado has our next question. He writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, just want to say I love listening to your show, and let's go Diet Coke." Now for my question. I've been wanting to get my wife into fly fishing and know she will be hooked as soon as she lands her first fish. Should I invest and buy her own fly rod and reel setup, thinking a 5 weight, or should I just let her use my rod as I help instruct her and be there to help land a fish? I have found that a 5 weight is almost perfect for every situation I have found myself in on our local rivers, like the Frying Pan and the Roaring Fork. Would you suggest if I were to get her a setup to go with a 5 weight or go with something like a 6 weight so she can also end up throwing bigger streamers down the line? Much appreciated, and tight lines. Well, Patrick, that is exactly how I want people to start their questions here at VFC. Everybody else, Patrick just put you on notice because that is how you start a question, right? Love your show and let's go Diet Coke. It does not get better than that. Oh, that was awesome, Patrick. You knocked it out of the park. First off here, with your question, congrats on taking your wife fishing. The chance to do something that you love with your spouse is awesome. Hopefully she enjoys it. And I'm sure a lot of folks are thinking right this very second that, oh, well, the quickest way to ruin a marriage is to try to teach your spouse to do something. And you know what? I have fallen victim to that. I think we all do at some point. I know one of the first times I took my wife out to fly fish, I think she was still my fiance at the time. Yeah, I think she was. I can't really remember. I'm pretty sure though. She kept telling me when we got done that I was getting too frustrated with her and that's why she didn't enjoy it too much. And I do not doubt for a second that I was getting way too frustrated with her. Uh, I think that happens to all of us. There's a lot of learning pains that go through it, but it's worth it, right? Because you'll learn a lot about yourself. You learn how to be a lot more patient. And if you have the opportunity to share something that you love so much with your spouse, I mean, that's just fantastic, right? It's hard to beat how much fun that is. Also, Patrick, I do want to say the fact that your wife is learning how to fly fish on the Frying Pan is nothing short of miraculous. Okay, that could be a tough river. It has whooped my butt more than a few times that I've been out there to fish it. It's wonderful, but y'all dang, that's a tough place to learn how to fish. So good on you. Oh, all right. I'll get out of the meta relationship stuff and really address your question here all the way. My recommendation would be, yeah, just get her own setup. Eventually, if she gets hooked on fly fishing, you're going to want to be able to fish together. You're not just going to want to be there to be the net man. Last summer, I was actually able to finally do that with my wife. We were able to fish together, and I wasn't just the guide / net man. And it was absolutely fantastic. My wife had progressed to the point where I tied on her flies for her. And I went over like, okay, well, here's where do you think the fish are? And she told me, and I was like, you don't need me here anymore. I'm going to go up there and fish. And she caught fish and I caught fish, and it was fantastic. I had so much fun doing that. So if you have the opportunity to have that kind of experience with your own wife, Patrick, then I think you ought to go for it, right? And I would absolutely say set her up with another 9'5" weight. The fly flinger is the option I would recommend 100%. You should definitely go check it out. We've redesigned them and they look beautiful. Don't miss your chance to get her a fly flinger. If she gets into streamers at that point, you just buy a 6 weight. But I really wouldn't worry about that until or unless she expresses an interest in throwing a lot of streamers. And even at that point, you can still fish streamers on a 5 weight. 6 weight is a little bit easier, but if funds are tight or whatever, that 5 weight is just going to be a little bit more versatile. So I'd go that way. And by the way, this is exactly the same advice that I would give you if you were asking about teaching a kid or a buddy or whatever, right? I would tell you the same stuff as I'm telling you for your wife as far as what you should get and how you should go about it, I think. A 9'5" weight's the go-to, and you should really only expand beyond that as a beginner if that beginner's actually ready for it, especially for trout fishing, right? That 9'5" weight's going to do so much for you, and it doesn't really make sense to move on until you've really mastered as much as you can just with the 5 weight. All right. Thank you so much for those questions, folks. And with that, we are going to end this week's show. I'm so grateful that you all were able to listen to the end, and hopefully you enjoyed it. I hope y'all are enjoying your time here at Untangled as much as I am, because it's a hoot for me every week. I love it. And if you have any questions that you would like answered on the show, please do not hesitate to send those in to us. That is what runs this show. Couldn't do it without your questions, couldn't do it without your engagement. So please do not hesitate to send questions in. There's always a link at the podcast description. And that engagement part I just talked about, if you can rate and subscribe to this show wherever you're listening to it, that would be wonderful. That helps make the show more visible. That helps the show reach more people. That helps us do more of what we aim to do here at VFC, which is make fly fishing accessible for as many folks as we possibly can. So everything you do to share the show, to tell people about it, that helps out a ton, and we love it. I love it. It makes me happy. I mean, every time we get a new rating or a new review for the podcast, I'm happier than if I got a fresh Diet Coke. It warms my soul that much, and I'm not being facetious. I appreciate it. Oh, and with that, folks, get out there, catch some fish, have fun, and until next week, tie lines, everybody.